Dr. Sarah Chen had spent 3 years on Kepler 442b studying the indigenous Vorthak species, and she thought she understood them. The massive scaled creatures stood nearly 8 feet tall with razor-sharp claws and teeth that could tear through reinforced steel. Their society was built around hunting, territory, and the strongest leading the pack. Every xenobiologist in the galaxy classified them as apex predators, dangerous, aggressive, and utterly incompatible with peaceful coexistence. The research station sat on the edge of Vorthak territory, a careful compromise that allowed human scientists to observe from what they believed was a safe distance. Sarah had watched the creatures through her instruments for months, documenting their hunting patterns, their complex social hierarchies, and their surprisingly sophisticated communication methods. She noticed something others had missed. Beneath all that predatory behavior was intelligence, deep emotional bonds, and something that looked remarkably like family structures. On the morning everything changed. Sarah was running her daily scans when her instruments detected unusual heat signatures from the main Vorthak settlement. She adjusted her long-range cameras and felt her blood freeze. Massive plumes of smoke rose from the crystalline structures the Vorthak called home. The settlement was burning, and it wasn't an accident. Through her enhanced viewing scope, she could see the attackers, sleek, metallic ships with the distinctive angular design of the hegemony forces. The galactic hegemony had been expanding aggressively across this sector, claiming worlds for their industrial operations. They had a policy of eliminating any species they deemed too dangerous for subjugation, and the Vorthak had clearly been marked for extinction. Sarah watched in horror as energy beams sliced through Vorthak dwellings. Adult Vorthak emerged to fight, their natural weapons useless against advanced technology. They fell one by one, their roars of defiance echoing across the valley even at this distance. The systematic nature of the attack made Sarah sick. This wasn't war. It was extermination. Her training screamed at her to maintain her distance, to document what she was seeing, to follow protocol and contact the research station command. But as she watched the massacre unfold, something deeper than training kicked in. These weren't just specimens to be studied. They were living beings with families, with children who needed protection. Sarah grabbed her emergency kit and portable scanner, making a decision that would either get her killed or change everything she thought she knew about humanity's place in the galaxy. The research station's rover was fast enough to reach the settlement, though she had no real plan beyond getting there and seeing if there was anything she could do to help. The journey across the rocky terrain took 20 minutes that felt like hours. With each passing second, the smoke grew thicker and the sounds of destruction louder. By the time Sarah reached the outskirts of the settlement, the hegemony ships had moved on, leaving behind a landscape of devastation that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Crystalline structures lay shattered, their beautiful geometric patterns reduced to jagged fragments. Bodies of adult Vorthak were scattered throughout the settlement, their natural armor pierced by energy weapons. The silence was almost worse than the earlier sounds of battle. It was the silence of a community that had ceased to exist in the span of an hour. Sarah moved carefully through the wreckage, her scanner detecting faint life signs deeper in the settlement. Following the signal, she made her way toward what appeared to be the central structure, partially collapsed but still standing. As she approached, she heard something that made her heart race, the high-pitched cries of Vorthak young. Inside the damaged structure, she found them huddled together in what must have been a nursery or protected area. 5 small Vorthak, none larger than a human child, their scales still soft and their eyes wide with terror. They couldn't have been more than a few months old, barely past hatching. Their parents and guardians were gone, and soon the hegemony cleanup crews would return to ensure no survivors remained. The cubs, for that's what they looked like to Sarah, despite their alien features, pressed against each other for comfort. Their small claws were already sharp, their teeth already pointed, but right now they were just frightened children who had lost everything. When they saw Sarah, they didn't attack or flee. Instead, they made soft, questioning sounds as if asking where their parents had gone. Sarah knelt slowly, speaking in the soothing tone she used with any frightened animal. She had studied enough Vorthak biology to know these young ones would need food, warmth, and protection soon, or they would die regardless of any rescue attempt. The nearest human facility was hours away, and there was no guarantee the hegemony wouldn't return to finish their work. Looking at those 5 small faces, Sarah made another decision that went against every protocol and safety regulation she had ever learned. She couldn't leave them here to die, and she couldn't wait for official help that might never come. These cubs needed someone willing to risk everything for creatures the galaxy had written off as monsters. She began gathering supplies from the wreckage, looking for anything that might help transport and care for 5 predator cubs who had just become orphans in a war they never asked to be part of. Sarah Chen, xenobiologist and supposedly objective scientist, was about to become something else entirely. A protector, a guardian, and possibly the only thing standing between 5 innocent lives and complete extinction. The first challenge was simply getting the cubs to trust her enough to be moved. Sarah had studied Vorthak behavior extensively, but academic knowledge proved very different from dealing with 5 terrified, newly orphaned predators. Each cub was roughly the size of a large dog, with developing claws that could easily shred human skin and bite strength that could crush bone. Yet as they huddled together making soft whimpering sounds, they seemed more like lost puppies than apex predators. Sarah slowly extended her hand toward the largest of the cubs, a female with distinctive silver markings along her neck. The young Vorthak sniffed cautiously, her nostrils flaring as she processed Sarah's scent. After a moment of consideration, the cub pressed her snout against Sarah's palm, seeking the warmth and comfort of contact. The other 4 watched this interaction carefully before gradually moving closer themselves. "Okay, little ones," Sarah whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "We need to get you somewhere safe." She had found a large cargo container in the wreckage that would serve as temporary transport. Working slowly and speaking constantly in soothing tones, Sarah managed to coax all 5 cubs into the container. She lined it with soft material salvaged from their destroyed home, fragments of what appeared to be bedding that still carried familiar scents. The journey back to the research station tested every limit of her rover's capabilities. The cargo container took up most of the vehicle's space, leaving Sarah cramped in the driver's seat while 5 increasingly agitated Vorthak cubs vocalized their distress behind her. They weren't built for confinement, and their natural instincts were clearly telling them that being trapped in a small space meant danger. Halfway back to the station, Sarah's communication system crackled to life. "Dr. Chen, this is Station Command. We're reading your rover returning from unauthorized coordinates. Please explain your deviation from approved research parameters." Sarah gripped the steering controls tighter. Station Commander Martinez was a by-the-book military officer who saw the research mission as a necessary but risky duty. He had made his position on Vorthak human contact very clear: maintain distance, observe only, and never engage. What she was about to tell him would likely end her career and possibly her freedom. "Station Command, this is Dr. Chen. I'm returning with 5 Vorthak juveniles who are the sole survivors of a hegemony attack on the primary settlement. The cubs require immediate care and protection." The silence on the communication channel stretched for nearly a minute. When Commander Martinez finally responded, his voice carried the tone of a man trying to process impossible information. "Dr. Chen, please confirm your last transmission. Did you say you have Vorthak aboard your rover?" "Confirmed, Command. 5 juveniles approximately 3 to 4 months old. Their parents and all adult members of their community were killed in what appears to be a systematic extermination operation. These cubs will die without intervention. Dr. Chen, you will halt your rover immediately and await instructions. Under no circumstances are you to bring potentially dangerous alien predators into this facility." Sarah looked at her dashboard display showing the distance to the station, still 40 minutes away. Behind her, she could hear the cubs becoming more distressed, their vocalizations growing louder and more urgent. They needed food, water, and proper care soon, or her rescue attempt would become pointless. "Negative, Command. These cubs are not dangerous. They're children who have lost everything. I'm continuing to the station." "Dr. Chen, that is a direct order. If you continue on your current course, I will have no choice but to activate lockdown protocols. The station's defenses will not distinguish between you and what Command will classify as hostile alien life forms." The threat hung in the air as Sarah processed her options. Station Command had automated defense systems designed to prevent any contamination or invasion. If Martinez activated lockdown, those systems would target her rover as a threat. She would be killed along with the cubs she was trying to save. But Sarah had spent 3 years studying Vorthak society, and she knew something Martinez didn't. These weren't mindless predators, they were intelligent beings capable of forming bonds, of learning, of becoming something more than their instincts. The cubs behind her had already shown trust in a human, something that according to all official reports should have been impossible. Commander Martinez, I understand your concerns, but I need you to trust my expertise here. These cubs represent an opportunity for peaceful contact with the Vorthak species. They can learn to see humans as allies rather than threats. What happened at their settlement doesn't have to be repeated across the galaxy. Dr. Chen, your emotional attachment is clouding your judgment. The Vorthak are classified as irredeemably hostile by Galactic Council standards. There is no possibility of peaceful coexistence. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. The Galactic Council made decisions based on incomplete data and prejudice, not actual understanding of alien cultures. They had written off entire species based on surface observations and fear of anything that didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable intelligence. The Galactic Council is wrong, Commander, and I'm going to prove it. She cut the communication link and pushed the rover to maximum speed. Behind her, one of the cubs had managed to push its snout through a gap in the cargo container and was making soft questioning sounds. Sarah reached back and gently touched the young Vorthak's nose. Hold on, little ones. We're going to show them what's possible when someone actually tries to understand instead of just fear. The research station appeared on the horizon, its defensive towers already beginning to track her approach. Sarah had perhaps 10 minutes before Martinez would be forced to make a decision that could kill them all. She needed a plan that would save 5 innocent lives and somehow convince a military commander that everything he believed about alien-human relations was wrong. Sarah's mind raced as she approached the research station's perimeter. The defensive towers were tracking her movement, their energy weapons charging with an ominous hum that she could hear even through the rover's hull. She had one chance to convince Commander Martinez that what she was doing could change everything. Humanity thought it knew about interspecies relations. Station Command. This is Dr. Chen requesting emergency xenobiology consultation protocols. The communication system remained silent for several seconds before Martinez responded, his voice tight with frustration. Dr. Chen, there are no protocols for the situation you have created. You are carrying potentially dangerous alien life forms toward a human facility in direct violation of... Commander, invoke Article 7 of the Xenobiological Research Charter, Sarah interrupted. Any researcher who discovers evidence of previously unknown, intelligent behavior in studied species has the right to emergency consultation with the full science team before any military action is taken. Sarah was gambling on Martinez's strict adherence to regulation. Article 7 was an obscure provision designed to prevent military personnel from interfering with potentially groundbreaking scientific discoveries. If she could convince him that the cubs represented new evidence about Vorthak intelligence, he would be legally required to let her present her case to the research team. Dr. Chen, the Vorthak intelligence parameters are already well established. Your specimens do not constitute new evidence of anything except your poor judgment. Commander, these cubs exhibited trust behavior toward a human within 20 minutes of first contact. According to all existing research, Vorthak should show immediate aggression toward any non-Vorthak species, especially humans. What I observed directly contradicts 3 years of behavioral data. Behind her, the cubs had grown quieter, perhaps sensing the tension in her voice. The largest female had managed to work her way closer to Sarah and was now making soft, almost purring sounds that seemed designed to comfort rather than communicate distress. This behavior was completely outside established Vorthak behavioral patterns, and Sarah prayed Martinez would recognize the significance. The rover was now within the station's outermost defense perimeter. Sarah could see personnel moving around the main building, and she knew some of them would be preparing for a potential lockdown scenario. Dr. James Okafor, the team's animal psychologist, appeared at one of the observation windows, his expression confused as he watched her approach. Dr. Chen, you have 60 seconds to reach the main airlock. If you attempt to bring those creatures inside the station proper, I will have no choice but to activate containment protocols. Sarah felt a spark of hope. Martinez hadn't said lockdown, he had said containment. That suggested he was at least considering the possibility that this might be a legitimate research situation rather than a security breach. She guided the rover into the station's outer bay, a large chamber designed for decontamination and initial examination of any materials brought back from field research. The outer bay doors sealed behind her with a heavy clang that made all 5 cubs vocalize their distress. Sarah quickly shut down the rover and moved to the cargo container, speaking in the same soothing tones that had calmed the cubs earlier. Through the bay's observation windows, she could see her entire research team gathering: Dr. Okafor, Dr. Lisa Park, the communications specialist, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the xenobotanist, and Commander Martinez himself, his hand hovering near the lockdown controls. Dr. Chen, exit your vehicle slowly and move to the decontamination chamber. Leave the alien specimens in the rover. Martinez's voice echoed through the bay's intercom system. Negative, Commander. These cubs are traumatized and require constant care. Separating them from the only familiar presence they have could cause psychological damage that would make any behavioral study meaningless. Through the observation windows, Sarah could see Dr. Okafor leaning forward with obvious interest. As an animal psychologist, he would understand the implications of what she was suggesting. Young animals bonding with members of different species was extremely rare and scientifically significant. Commander Martinez, Dr. Okafor's voice came through the intercom. If Dr. Chen is correct about the bonding behavior, separating the subjects from her now could permanently damage their psychological development. We might be looking at the first recorded case of cross-species imprinting in Vorthak juveniles. Sarah carefully opened the cargo container, and 5 small Vorthak heads immediately oriented toward her. The cubs had clearly associated her scent and voice with safety, and they pressed against her legs as she stood among them. The largest female made a series of soft chirping sounds while looking up at Sarah's face, behavior that looked remarkably like a request for reassurance. "My God," Dr. Park whispered, her voice carrying through the intercom. "They're treating her like a parent figure." Commander Martinez stared through the observation window at the scene in the decontamination bay. Sarah stood calmly among 5 juvenile Vorthak, creatures that should have been attacking her on sight according to every piece of data in their files. Instead, they were clustered around her like children seeking comfort from a trusted adult. "Dr. Chen, this behavior. How long have you observed this level of trust?" "It began within minutes of first contact, Commander. These cubs lost everything today. Their parents, their home, their entire community. But they still chose to trust a human stranger. That suggests a capacity for adaptation and emotional intelligence that completely contradicts our understanding of their species." Sarah knelt among the cubs, and they immediately moved closer, making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like contentment. The sight of a human researcher surrounded by supposedly deadly predators who were behaving like affectionate pets created a cognitive dissonance that forced everyone watching to question their assumptions. "Commander," Dr. Okafor said, "we need to study this. If these cubs can form genuine emotional bonds with humans, it means the entire Vorthak species has been misunderstood. This could change how humanity approaches first contact with every apex predator species in the galaxy." Martinez looked at the readings from the bay's sensors, which showed no signs of aggression or distress from any of the Vorthak cubs. After 3 years of research indicating that peaceful contact with adult Vorthak was impossible, he was watching proof that the young of the species might be entirely different. "Dr. Chen, you and your charges will remain in quarantine containment while we develop protocols for this situation. But I want a full report on every aspect of your interaction with these cubs, and I want it within 6 hours. Sarah felt relief wash over her as the immediate threat of lockdown passed. She had bought time for the cubs and herself. But she knew the real challenge was just beginning. She needed to prove that what she had discovered wasn't just a temporary fluke, but evidence of a capacity for peaceful coexistence that could prevent the extinction of an entire species. The quarantine containment area had been hastily modified to accommodate 5 growing Vorthak cubs, but it was clear the facility wasn't designed for long-term care of large predators. Sarah spent her first night sleeping on the floor next to the cubs who had refused to settle unless she remained close. The largest female, whom Sarah had started calling Nova for the silver star-like markings on her neck, seemed to have appointed herself as the group's primary communicator with their human guardian. Dr. Okafor arrived early the next morning with a portable behavioral analysis kit and the expression of barely contained excitement. Through the containment barrier, he watched as Sarah went through what appeared to be a morning routine with the cubs, checking each one for signs of illness or distress, providing food she had synthesized from their known dietary requirements, and engaging in what looked remarkably like play behavior. "Sarah, this is incredible," he said through the intercom. Nova is demonstrating classic signs of attachment behavior. Look at how she positions herself between you and the other cubs. She's treating you like a pack leader. Sarah observed Nova's behavior and realized Okafor was right. The young Vorthak had naturally fallen into a social hierarchy with Sarah at the top, something that should have been impossible according to existing research. Adult Vorthak only followed other Vorthak, and even then only after establishing dominance through combat trials. It gets more interesting. James, watch this. Sarah moved to the far side of the containment area and called Nova's name. The cub immediately left the others and approached, making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like questions. She's learned to recognize her name in just 12 hours. The others are starting to respond to names too. Dr. Park entered the observation area carrying a sophisticated translation matrix, her usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious excitement. Sarah, I've been analyzing the vocalizations you recorded yesterday. The cubs aren't just making random sounds, they're using distinct vocal patterns that correspond to different emotional states and needs. It's primitive, but it's definitely intentional communication. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If Vorthak cubs could learn names and engage in intentional communication with humans, it meant their species possessed linguistic capabilities that had been completely overlooked in adult specimens. The question was whether this was unique to juveniles, or if adult Vorthak had simply never been given the opportunity to demonstrate these abilities. Commander Martinez joined the group, carrying a secured communication tablet that immediately drew everyone's attention. Dr. Chen, I've been in contact with Galactic Command about your situation. The official response is complicated. Sarah felt her stomach clench. She had known that bringing the cubs to the station would eventually attract attention from higher authorities. But she had hoped for more time to establish proof of their potential for peaceful coexistence. The hegemony has filed an official complaint claiming that human researchers are interfering with legitimate territorial expansion operations. They're demanding that any Vorthak survivors be turned over to their custody for proper disposal. The cubs seemed to sense the tension in the room, gathering closer to Sarah and making soft, worried sounds. Nova pressed against Sarah's leg and looked up at her with what could only be described as trust and concern. Commander, these are children, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. The hegemony is asking us to hand over innocent babies for execution. I understand your position, Dr. Chen, but Galactic Command is also under pressure from the Scientific Council, who want the cubs transferred to a proper research facility for comprehensive study. They're arguing that a field research station isn't equipped for long-term alien care. Dr. Okafor stepped forward, his usually mild demeanor replaced by fierce determination. Commander, transferring these cubs now would be scientifically disastrous. They've formed a critical bond with Sarah that took extraordinary circumstances to create. Moving them to a sterile research facility would break that bond and likely make them revert to standard Vorthak, aggressive behavior patterns. Moreover, Dr. Park added, we're on the verge of a breakthrough in xenolinguistic communication. These cubs are learning human linguistic patterns at a rate that suggests incredible adaptive intelligence. Give us more time, and we might be able to establish actual conversation with a Vorthak for the first time in galactic history. Sarah knelt among the cubs, who immediately surrounded her in what had become their standard protective formation. As she looked at their young faces, still alien but somehow expressive in ways she was only beginning to understand, she made a decision that would define not just her career but potentially humanity's future, relationship with aggressive species across the galaxy. Commander, I formally request emergency sanctuary protocols under the Sentient Species Protection Act. These cubs have demonstrated intelligence, emotional capacity, and the ability to form interspecies bonds. They qualify for protection as developing sentient beings. Martinez stared at her through the containment barrier. The Sentient Species Protection Act was rarely invoked and required extensive documentation, but it would give them legal standing to resist both hegemony demands and scientific council transfer orders while a full investigation was conducted. Dr. Chen, do you understand what you're requesting? Invoking the SSPA means claiming these cubs are not just intelligent animals, but developing persons with rights under galactic law. That's never been done for a species classified as irredeemably hostile. Sarah looked down at Nova, who had been watching the conversation with obvious interest, despite not understanding the words. The young Vorthak made a soft questioning sound and tilted her head in a gesture that looked remarkably like curiosity. Commander, 3 days ago I would have said it was impossible, but I'm watching these cubs learn, adapt, and form emotional bonds that contradict everything we thought we knew about their species. If we don't give them the chance to prove what they can become, we'll never know if we condemned an entire people to extinction based on our own fear and misunderstanding. The room fell silent, except for the soft vocalizations of the cubs as they settled around Sarah. 5 small lives hung in the balance, but the implications reached far beyond one research station. If Sarah was right, humanity was about to discover that intelligence and the capacity for peace could emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important discoveries required someone willing to risk everything for those who couldn't speak for themselves. I'll file the preliminary SSPA documentation, Martinez said finally. But Sarah, you better be right about this, because if you're not, we're all going to face charges for protecting creatures that the galaxy considers too dangerous to exist. 2 weeks into the SSPA investigation, the cubs had transformed from traumatized refugees into something unprecedented in galactic xenobiology. Vorthak juveniles who actively sought out human interaction and appeared to enjoy learning. Sarah's daily routine had evolved into what could only be described as a cross-species education program, with 5 eager students who absorbed new concepts at a rate that amazed. Even the most optimistic researchers. Nova had progressed beyond simple name recognition to understanding basic commands and even simple questions. When Sarah asked, "Where is your food?" Nova would lead her to the feeding area. When asked, "Who are your family?" Nova would vocalize and gesture toward the other 4 cubs. Most remarkably, when Sarah asked, "Are you happy?" Nova would make a distinctive purring sound and nuzzle against her guardian's hand. Dr. Park had documented over 50 distinct vocalizations from the cubs, each with consistent meaning and context. The smaller male cub, whom they called Echo for his tendency to repeat sounds, had begun attempting to mimic human speech patterns. His efforts produced sounds that were clearly distorted by Vorthak vocal anatomy, but the intent was unmistakable. He was trying to speak human words. "Sarah, you need to see this," Dr. Okafor called through the intercom as he reviewed the morning's behavioral recordings. "Watch Nova's reaction when Yuki arrives with the plant samples." On the monitor, Sarah could see Dr. Tanaka entering the observation area, carrying her daily selection of native plants for nutritional analysis. The moment Nova spotted the xenobotanist, the cub made an excited chirping sound and moved to the containment barrier, pressing her snout against the transparent aluminum as if greeting a friend. She recognizes individual team members now, Sarah realized. And look at the others, they're all reacting differently to different people. Indeed, each cub had developed distinct preferences for different humans. Echo was most excited by Dr. Park's visits and would attempt to mimic the sounds of her translation equipment. The twin females, Harmony and Symphony, showed the greatest interest in Dr. Tanaka's botanical work and would carefully examine any plant material she brought near the barrier. The smallest cub, whom they called Whisper for his quiet nature, had formed an attachment to Commander Martinez that surprised everyone, especially Martinez himself. The commander had initially visited the containment area only for official inspections, but Whisper's consistent attempts to get his attention had gradually drawn him into brief interactions. Now Martinez found himself spending a few minutes each day simply talking to the small Vorthak, who would listen intently and respond with soft, thoughtful vocalizations. "Commander," Dr. Okafor observed, "I think Whisper is trying to learn leadership behavior from you. Vorthak's social structure is heavily hierarchical, and he seems to recognize you as the pack leader of the humans." The breakthrough that changed everything came during the 3rd week, when Nova did something that forced everyone to reconsider not just Vorthak intelligence, but the nature of consciousness itself. Sarah had been teaching the cubs simple concepts using visual aids, images of different objects, actions, and even emotions displayed on a portable screen. Nova had learned to recognize and respond appropriately to dozens of these images, but that day she did something unprecedented. When Sarah showed an image of a Vorthak adult, Nova made her usual recognition sound. But then she approached the screen and, using her claw, very deliberately drew a simple symbol in the dust on the containment room floor. It was crude, but unmistakably intentional. 3 parallel lines that roughly matched the distinctive scale pattern she bore on her neck. "My God," Dr. Park whispered. She just created a written symbol to represent herself. The implications sent shockwaves through the research team. Tool use was one marker of intelligence, but symbolic representation, the ability to create abstract symbols to represent concepts, was considered a hallmark of truly sentient thought. Nova hadn't just learned to recognize herself in images. She had invented a way to communicate her identity through symbolic representation. Word of the discovery spread quickly through official channels, and within hours Sarah received a priority communication from Admiral Rebecca Walsh, head of the Galactic Council's Xenobiological Assessment Division. "Dr. Chen, the Council has reviewed your preliminary reports, and I must say the implications are staggering. If your documentation is accurate, we may be looking at the first recorded case of accelerated sentience development in a species previously classified as pre-sentient." Sarah stood among the cubs as she took the call, and Nova immediately moved to her side, as if sensing the importance of the conversation. "Admiral Walsh, these cubs are demonstrating cognitive abilities that suggest their species was never pre-sentient. We simply never had the opportunity to observe their full potential. Dr. Chen, I'm going to be direct with you. The hegemony is putting enormous pressure on the Council to classify your cubs as aberrations, genetic mutations that don't represent their species as a whole. They're arguing that 5 juveniles don't constitute proof that adult Vorthak are capable of peaceful coexistence." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had known this argument would eventually surface, but hearing it stated so bluntly made her realize how much opposition they still faced. "However," the Admiral continued, "there are members of the Council who believe your work represents a fundamental breakthrough in xenobiological understanding. Senator Elizabeth Harrison from the Human Colonial Authority has proposed a radical solution to the current impasse." Nova made a soft, questioning sound and pressed closer to Sarah, as if offering comfort. The young Vorthak had learned to recognize stress in human body language and consistently tried to provide reassurance when her guardian seemed troubled. "What kind of solution, Admiral?" "A formal presentation to the full Galactic Council. You would bring the cubs to the Council chambers on New Geneva and demonstrate their capabilities before representatives from every member species. It would be the first time Vorthak of any age have appeared before the Council, and the first time living specimens have been used to argue for reclassification of an entire species." Sarah looked down at Nova, who was watching her with obvious intelligence and concern. The idea of subjecting the cubs to the stress of interstellar travel and formal presentation seemed cruel, but it might be their only chance to save not just these 5 lives, but their entire species. "Admiral, what happens if the Council isn't convinced?" "Then the cubs would be transferred to permanent research containment, and the Vorthak species classification would remain unchanged. The hegemony's expansion into Vorthak territory would continue as planned." Sarah knelt and gently touched Nova's snout. The cub immediately made her contented purring sound and leaned into the contact, trusting and affectionate in a way that no one had believed possible for her species. "Admiral Walsh, we'll do it. These cubs deserve the chance to speak for their people, even if they're too young to understand what that means." As Sarah ended the communication, she realized that 5 orphaned Vorthak cubs were about to become ambassadors for their entire species, carrying the hopes of a people most of the galaxy considered monsters. The nest had been in flames when she found them, but perhaps from those ashes, something unprecedented could be born, proof that understanding and compassion could bridge even the greatest differences between species. The journey to New Geneva took 3 days aboard the research vessel Endeavour, and every hour tested the cubs' adaptation to new environments. Sarah had worried that the stress of spaceflight might cause them to revert to more aggressive behaviors, but instead they seemed fascinated by their new surroundings. Nova spent hours at the observation ports, watching stars stream past and making soft vocalizations that Dr. Park was convinced contained questions about what they were seeing. The cubs had grown considerably during their month at the research station. Nova now stood nearly 4 feet tall, and her claws had developed to the point where they required careful monitoring during interactions. Yet rather than becoming more dangerous as they matured, the cubs had become more sophisticated in their social behaviors, showing increased empathy and emotional intelligence. Commander Martinez, who had initially viewed the cubs as a security threat, now found himself genuinely attached to Whisper, who had continued to shadow him whenever possible. The small Vorthak had learned to recognize and respond to basic military commands, and Martinez had begun teaching him simple tactical concepts that Whisper absorbed with startling comprehension. "You know, Sarah," Martinez confided as they watched Whisper successfully navigate a puzzle that Dr. Okafor had designed to test problem-solving skills. "I've trained human soldiers who weren't this quick to understand complex instructions. If adult Vorthak have even half this learning capacity, we've been catastrophically wrong about them." The Galactic Council chambers on New Geneva were an imposing blend of architecture from dozens of member species, designed to accommodate everything from the aquatic delegates of Hydros Prime to the crystalline representatives of the Silicate Collective. As Sarah and her team prepared the cubs for their presentation, she couldn't help but notice how out of place 5 young predators seemed in this monument to civilized discourse. Admiral Walsh met them at the special containment area that had been prepared for the cubs, her expression carefully neutral. "Dr. Chen, I want you to understand the magnitude of what you're attempting. In 300 years of galactic governance, no species has ever been reclassified from hostile to potentially peaceful based on juvenile behavior. The Council is deeply skeptical." Sarah watched Nova exploring their temporary quarters, the young Vorthak moving with growing confidence, but still seeking reassurance from her human guardian. "Admiral, these cubs represent proof that intelligence and the capacity for peaceful relationships exist within the Vorthak genome. If we can't recognize that potential, how can we claim to be a civilized society?" The presentation chamber had been modified with a transparent containment field that would allow the Council delegates to observe the cubs safely while still permitting normal interaction. Representatives from 47 different species filled the tiered seating, their various communication devices creating a subtle symphony of translation matrices and sensory enhancers. Counselor Thex of the Hegemony occupied a prominent position near the front, his metallic features displaying obvious disdain for the proceedings. "Esteemed colleagues, we are here to witness an elaborate justification for protecting creatures that represent an existential threat to peaceful species throughout the galaxy. 5 juveniles displaying unusual behavior cannot override years of evidence regarding adult Vorthak aggression." Senator Harrison stood to respond, her voice carrying across the chamber with practiced authority. "Counselor Thex, we are here because these unusual behaviors include symbolic communication, emotional bonding across species lines, and demonstrated learning capabilities that suggest we have fundamentally misunderstood an entire people." Sarah entered the containment area with all 5 cubs, who immediately arranged themselves around her in their familiar protective formation. The sight of full-grown Vorthak, even juveniles, caused visible tension among some delegates. Several representatives from prey species shifted uncomfortably as they observed claws and teeth that could easily prove lethal. "Honored delegates," Sarah began. 6 weeks ago, these cubs lost everything they had ever known. Their families were killed, their homes destroyed, and they were left alone in a hostile world. According to everything we thought we knew about Vorthak psychology, they should have either died from the trauma or reverted to pure predatory instincts. Nova moved closer to Sarah and made a soft vocalization that Dr. Park's translation equipment identified as a request for reassurance. Sarah gently touched the young Vorthak's head, and Nova immediately relaxed, her body language shifting from alert to content. Instead, they chose trust. They chose to see a human as a protector rather than an enemy. They chose to learn our customs, our language, and our social behaviors. Every day they continue to choose cooperation over conflict. Dr. Okafor activated the behavioral analysis displays, showing weeks of recorded interactions between humans and cubs. The delegates watched as Echo attempted to mimic human speech, as Harmony and Symphony worked together to solve complex puzzles, as Whisper demonstrated his understanding of military hierarchy by responding to Commander Martinez's commands. But the moment that truly captured the chamber's attention came when Nova approached the containment barrier and, using her claw on the specially prepared surface, drew the same 3-line symbol she had created weeks earlier. Then, looking directly at the assembled delegates, she drew 4 additional symbols, crude but unmistakable representations of her 4 companions. She's introducing them to you, Dr. Park explained, her voice filled with wonder even after weeks of observing the cub's development. She understands that this is a formal meeting, and she's following what she perceives as proper social protocol. Counselor Vex of the Aquatic Confederation leaned forward in her environmental suit. Dr. Chen, these displays are remarkable, but how can we be certain that this behavior would translate to adult Vorthak? Juvenile adaptability often disappears with maturity in predator species. Sarah had anticipated this question, and she had prepared an answer that would either convince the council or end their hopes permanently. Counselor Vex Nova has begun showing signs of approaching adolescence. Her hormone levels indicate she's entering the transitional phase that leads to adult behavioral patterns. If Vorthak intelligence was purely juvenile, we would expect to see regression in her learning capabilities. She activated a display showing Nova's learning curve over the past month. Rather than plateauing or declining, the young Vorthak's ability to master new concepts had actually accelerated as she approached maturity. Instead, we see continued improvement. Nova is becoming more sophisticated in her thinking, more complex in her emotional responses, and more capable of abstract reasoning. This suggests that Vorthak intelligence develops progressively, reaching full potential in adulthood, exactly the opposite of the current classification assumptions. Whisper had been watching Commander Martinez throughout the presentation, and now he approached the barrier near where the commander stood. The small Vorthak drew his own symbol and then pointed to Martinez, clearly indicating that he understood the human's role and wanted to acknowledge him before this important gathering. The gesture created a moment of silence in the chamber as delegates processed what they had witnessed. A supposedly mindless predator had just demonstrated social awareness, formal protocol, and personal loyalty in a context that no Vorthak had ever experienced before. Senator Harrison stood again, her voice carrying new conviction. Honored delegates, we have seen proof that intelligence, empathy, and the capacity for peaceful relationship exist within the Vorthak genetic template. The question before us is not whether these cubs are exceptional, it's whether we will give their species the chance to prove that peaceful coexistence is possible. Counselor, Thex activated his communication device, his artificial voice cutting through the chamber's contemplative quiet. Even if we accept these juveniles as evidence of potential intelligence, the adult Vorthak remain irredeemably violent. The hegemony has extensive documentation of their aggressive behavior toward peaceful contact attempts. Sarah felt her heart race as she prepared to make the argument that would determine everything. Looking down at Nova, who was watching the proceedings with obvious intelligence and concern, she found her voice. Counselor Thex, perhaps the adult Vorthak have been violent because we never gave them reason to be otherwise. We approached them as enemies, classified them as monsters, and gave them no option except to fight for their survival. These cubs show us what might have been possible if we had approached their species with understanding instead of fear. The chamber fell silent as delegates considered her words. 5 young lives stood at the center of a debate that would determine the fate of an entire species and possibly reshape how humanity and its allies approached every first contact situation in the future. The council's deliberation lasted 18 hours, during which Sarah remained with the cubs in their containment area, trying to keep them calm despite the unprecedented stress of the situation. Nova seemed to understand that something important was happening, staying close to Sarah and occasionally making soft vocalizations that sounded like questions. The other cubs followed her lead, creating a small pocket of trust and affection in the midst of political uncertainty. When the council reconvened, the chamber's atmosphere had shifted. Representatives who had seemed skeptical the day before now watched the cubs with something approaching wonder. Even Counselor Thex appeared less hostile, though his stance remained rigid as Admiral. Walsh called for the formal vote. The question before the council is whether to reclassify the Vorthak species from irredeemably hostile to potentially peaceful pending further investigation. This reclassification would halt all military action against Vorthak populations and establish protected status for their remaining territories. Senator Harrison stood first. The Human Colonial Authority votes in favor of reclassification. We have seen undeniable evidence that the Vorthak possess intelligence, emotional depth, and the capacity for peaceful relationships. To ignore this evidence would be a betrayal of everything we claim to represent as a civilized society. One by one, Other representatives cast their votes. The Aquatic Confederation supported reclassification, citing the Cubs' demonstrated understanding of social hierarchy. The Silicate Collective, typically neutral in biological matters, voted in favor after analyzing the mathematical precision of Nova's symbolic drawings. The Avian Republic's natural enemies of ground-based predators surprised everyone by supporting protection for the Vorthak after observing Harmony and Symphony's cooperative problem-solving abilities. But several key representatives remained opposed. The Herbivore Alliance maintained that predator species could never be truly peaceful, while the machine consciousness argued that biological entities were inherently unpredictable and therefore dangerous. As the votes accumulated, it became clear that the decision would come down to Councillor Thex and the hegemony's position. If they maintained their opposition, they could block reclassification even if every other representative supported it. Thex activated his communication device, his artificial voice filling the chamber. The hegemony has reviewed all evidence presented regarding these specimens. While their behavior is admittedly unusual, 5 juveniles cannot override decades of documented adult aggression. Adult Vorthak have killed thousands of peaceful beings across multiple worlds. The risk of reclassification is too great. Sarah felt despair beginning to settle in her chest. They had come so far, shown so much evidence, but political fear was going to condemn an entire species to extinction. Then Whisper did something that changed everything. The small Vorthak had been watching Commander Martinez throughout the proceedings, and now he approached the containment barrier near where Martinez stood. Instead of drawing his usual symbol, Whisper began making a complex series of vocalizations, sounds that Dr. Park's equipment identified as an attempt to mimic human speech patterns. Martinez, Whisper said clearly, his alien vocal cords struggling with the unfamiliar sounds. Friend good. The chamber fell into absolute silence. A Vorthak had just spoken a human name and declared friendship in basic galactic, something that according to all existing research should have been utterly impossible. Whisper wasn't finished. He turned toward the assembled delegates and in halting but unmistakable basic said, Vorthak, good, no, fight, peace. The implications hit every delegate simultaneously. This wasn't just learning or mimicry. This was a Vorthak actively choosing to communicate with potential enemies, expressing a desire for peace in a language that required enormous effort for his species to produce. Commander Martinez stepped closer to the containment barrier, his usual military composure cracking as he looked at the small creature, who had somehow learned to speak his language. Whisper, do you understand what you just said? The young Vorthak nodded, a distinctly human gesture he had learned from observing his guardian. Understand. Peace good, fight bad. Vorthak want peace. Councillor Thex stared at Whisper for long moments, his metallic features processing what he had witnessed. A supposedly mindless predator had just articulated complex concepts about peace and conflict resolution in a language that wasn't his own. The entire foundation of hegemony policy toward the Vorthak had just crumbled before his sensors. This is unexpected, Thex admitted, his voice losing its usual certainty. If juveniles can achieve this level of linguistic and conceptual development, then our assumptions about adult capabilities may require revision. Nova moved to join Whisper at the barrier, and in careful practiced basic said, Vorthak children, learn peace from humans, want save family. The phrase want save family struck the chamber like a physical blow. Nova wasn't just speaking. She was expressing hope that peaceful contact might somehow help the adult Vorthak who were still fighting for survival across the galaxy. Admiral Walsh stood slowly, her voice carrying a weight that acknowledged they were witnessing a moment that would reshape interstellar relations. Councillor Thex, will the hegemony reconsider its position? Thex looked at the 5 cubs who were now all standing together at the barrier, their body language expressing hope and trust, despite everything their species had endured. Whisper had continued practicing his speech, and the other cubs were beginning to attempt their own words in basic. The hegemony withdraws its objection to reclassification, Thex said finally. These beings have demonstrated capabilities that require immediate cessation of all military operations against their species pending comprehensive behavioral assessment. The chamber erupted as representatives from dozens of species voted, overwhelmingly to reclassify the Vorthak and establish immediate protection for their remaining populations. Senator Harrison was crying openly as she cast the deciding vote, and even some of the more stoic non-human representatives showed signs of emotion. Sarah knelt among the cubs, who pressed around her in their familiar protective formation, chattering excitedly in a mixture of Vorthak vocalizations and attempted basic words. They didn't fully understand what had just happened, but they could sense the joy and relief of the humans they had come to love. Nova, "Whisper, all of you," Sarah whispered. "You just saved your people." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the newly constructed Vorthak Human Cultural Exchange Center on Kepler 442b, watching as adult Vorthak survivors worked alongside human engineers to rebuild their settlement. The cubs, now approaching full adolescence, served as translators and cultural bridges between the two species. Commander Martinez had requested a transfer to the exchange program, where he worked with Whisper to develop new protocols for peaceful first contact with predator species. Dr. Park had established the galaxy's first xenolinguistic program, specifically for cross-species communication, while Dr. Okafor documented behavioral patterns that were revolutionizing understanding of intelligence in apex predators. Nova, now nearly 6 feet tall and possessing claws that could slice through steel, spent her days teaching young human children about Vorthak culture, while learning advanced mathematics from human instructors. The sight of human children playing safely with a creature their parents had once considered a monster had become a symbol of hope across the galaxy. The nest had been in flames when Sarah found 5 terrified cubs, but from those ashes had emerged something unprecedented, proof that understanding, compassion, and the willingness to risk everything for innocent lives could bridge any divide. 5 orphaned predators had become ambassadors for peace, showing the galaxy that the capacity for growth, learning, and love existed in even the most unexpected places. As Sarah watched Nova carefully help a human child pronounce her name in Vorthak, she smiled. Sometimes the most important discoveries came not from studying distant stars or analyzing complex data, but from simple acts of kindness toward those who needed protection most. The cubs had taught humanity that every species deserved the chance to choose peace over war, understanding over fear, and hope over extinction.